Genshin Impacts card illustrations have been fascinating to me ever since I first saw them. As artist myself, I've been really interested in finding out what goes into drawing them, and for today's video I share my learnings from breaking down the art style that is used in these illustrations. Prior to drawing these illustrations, the character in it is designed at first, if you're interested in this as well, which would be the step before drawing the illustration. I also made a video analyzing Genshin's character designs and determining steps to take for designing your own Genshin characters, and I recommend checking it out before or after this one. One thing to note here is that there is some variation within the card illustrations, since there's not just one artist working on them and there have been some developments over time in how the characters are drawn. In this video I focus on things that tend to apply to most of the card illustrations. To analyze art styles, I find breaking the art down into different parts helpful, since that way you don't get overwhelmed by all the information in the image. Because of this, I go through these different aspects one by one, describing how they are portrayed in the Genshin art style. After this, I also apply what I mentioned to my own character, so you can see how this can be applied while drawing. Let's start with the first aspect. This would be the composition, or how the character is portrayed in post. Firstly, the pose will usually fit to the character's personality. Extroverted characters' poses tend to be more expressive, while for introverted ones, they have their body parts such as their legs or arms closer to their bodies often. The poses for the characters are expressive. Often the body is portrayed with lots of curves. The gesture is exaggerated, meaning you don't just have a stretched out arm, but rather a very stretched out arm. Flow is an important element to include here as well. The poses are usually flowy in that the arms, legs, torso and head form nice shapes and follow a direction or motion, and the clothing or hair oftentimes adds to this. The character looks like they're in motion, and in some cases it also looks like wind is blowing around them. Also, I actually drew all of the Genshin Impact card poses myself as an exercise and to learn more about them. For this I first drew a quick basic gesture pose, then some guidelines with a basic body, and finally I traced over the full card. Like this I could see how far off my drawings were and what my tendencies are when drawing poses. Mostly I recognized how my drawings tended to be less exaggerated. The bodies also turned out more flat most of the time, and I will also make a video talking more about this journey of drawing well more than 60 Genshin character poses and what I learned throughout it, and maybe I'll also make a small game since where I have time lapses of drawing the poses, and you could start with drawing the pose and then guess which character this is. So for any Genshin fans like this, you can maybe test how well you remember the illustrations, and yeah, I thought this could be fun. If you want to see me actually draw all the Genshin Impact card poses, you can look forward to my future videos. I mentioned I would include a drawing of a basic body in this video, but if you want to also see me apply what I mentioned to actual card illustrations, I will also do this in a future video. Now we're moving on to line art. For line art, pretty different line thickness is used. Silhouette and face outlines tend to be thicker than inner and detail lines. What's important to note here is that the Genshin art style can appear more or less painterly. For some cards you'll have a bit more and cleaner lines, while for others there are less and the lines transition into the colors more. Another important thing to note here would be that almost no straight lines are used. They all tend to be pretty rounded. The lines can also be a bit sketchy. Color-wise, you mostly have dark brown color lines. Sometimes they are also colored slightly darker than the flat color around them. Next, let's move on to the proportions and bodies. You likely know that in Genshin Impact you have 5 different body types: medium and tall male and female, as well as short female. For the 3D models of these characters, the proportions tend to be around the same. For the card illustrations, they vary a bit more, but you'll still have the characters with the medium female body type appear similar to other ones with the same type, for example here. Here would be the overall proportions used for each body type, also comparing the 3D models to the card illustrations here. For the short female body type, they are around 5 heads tall. Here you have very small shoulders, a wide waist and hips, and straight short arms and legs. The proportions are similar to chibis, and the neck is very thin. Next would be medium female. The bodies are around 6.5 heads tall. For these we have a thin upper body with small shoulders and a thin waist. The hips are wider than shoulders. Overall the legs are wider and more curvy than for the male body types here. The necks are slightly thinner than for the medium male characters. Next would be tall female. The bodies are around 7 heads tall. These are similar to the medium female ones, but the bodies are taller and the chest is bigger. The hips and lower body appear slightly thinner compared to the upper body here. The necks are slightly wider than for the medium female characters. For the medium male body type, the bodies are around 6.5 heads tall. Here the upper body tends to be rather thin. The shoulders are slightly wider than the hips, while the waist is slightly thinner than it. The legs are often rather wide. The necks for these characters tend to be rather thin. Finally, we have the tall male body type. The bodies are around 7.5 heads tall. Compared to the medium male one, the upper bodies are wider. Especially the arms, chest and shoulders have more volume. The legs are thinner and rather straight in comparison to this. The neck also is the widest here. To overall describe the bodies used here, they are rather thin and stylized, the limbs tend to be flowy, and for the necks they're rather thin and long. Male and older characters tend to have wider necks. Hands can be very simplified and a bit blocky or more detailed. This is unique for each card. Also, one thing I noticed here was that in this card for Noelle, the hands seem kind of small. They're a lot smaller than the face, whereas for the other cards, the hands tend to have around the same size as the face, except for the short female characters. And finally, to portray anatomy, skin shading and knot lines are usually used. After the body, let's now move on to the face. We start with the face shape. Here we have a pretty rounded jaw where the chin can appear pointy or rounded. In some cases it protrudes less and some more. While the faces appear rather full, overall the outer edge is a bit flat at the same time. There is a balance between roundness and flatness in the face shape. For younger and feminine characters, the cheeks and lower part of the face tend to have more volume. They appear more full and the head appears wider, whereas for male characters, especially older male ones, the faces will be taller and more slim. The change of direction from jaw to chin, meaning where the face shape outline transitions from going outwards from the chin to upwards to the cheekbones, appears mostly at the mouth level, but for some characters a bit higher up at around the nose level. This also depends on the angle the head is viewed at in the card. Next, let's move on to the nose, which is often portrayed as just a shadow or light. In other cases, you also have one or two lines here. One line will be used for more frontal-facing faces and younger feminine characters, while two lines and sometimes a added nostril tend to be used for the more from the side viewed head angles and older male characters, making the nose appear a bit more defined. Overall, the nose does not have too much contrast on the face usually. It also doesn't take up too much space. The noses of Genshin characters appear smaller due to this. After the nose, let's move on to the mouth, which is portrayed with a line that in some cases has empty spaces and varying light thickness. It is pretty small but can also be rather expressive for some characters. Often the mouth corners are a bit thicker than the inner part of the mouth. Many characters have a neutral expression here though. Some female characters have slight lip gloss, and here for Wanderer a chin indication is added underneath the mouth as well. Next, it's time to talk about the eyebrows. These are different for each character, but in general they're made up of a outlined shape. This shape often is pretty straight but can also be slightly curved or asymmetrical. The eyebrows tend to be placed a bit higher up on the face often, but for male characters or depending on the character and the expression, they can also be further down, for example for Zhongli or Neuvillette here. I would also add that the eyebrow shape can be unique for each character, making them stand out. It's similar with the next aspect, the eyes. First, let's start with their placement. They're usually in the lower half of the head. They can also be pretty far apart on the face, which for me would mean they can be more than one eye apart. The eye's shape here tends to be rectangular, rounded or almond-like. This depends on the character. It's similar with how tall or narrow the eyes appear overall. A rough guide for the eye size would be that eyes for younger and feminine characters are bigger and taller than eyes for older and male characters. Next, for the eyelashes. For all characters, you'll have a lash at the upper outer eye corner. Other than this, the additional lashes can be placed on the upper or lower lash. Usually these tend to be around 1 to 4 different additional ones. Finally, for lines around the eye, here we'd have one line above the eye, which can be longer or shorter. This depends on the character again. And for some characters, a second line will also be added. Next, for what's in the eye shape, the iris. For the shape of this, it's similar to the eye shape itself. For bigger, taller eyes, the iris will be bigger and taller, while for more narrow eyes, it will be wider and smaller. While the shading of the iris can be a bit different for each character, here is one way I determined for layers to use for iris shading that looks similar to Genshin Impacts. First, we have the base. Next would be a shadow. For some characters, a second shadow color will be added. Next would be the light at the bottom of the iris. For this, 2 different layers can be used. And finally, we'd have the pupil, which can be bright or dark on another layer. Additional layers to add here can include a light under the upper eyelash or smaller details within the iris. And this could include a circle within the iris, some small strokes, or adding a saturated border, or some small strokes. The pupil can also be very different for each character in size and shape. Often it's a bigger circle, and in some cases there is a light inside. For Klee, you have a dark pupil, and for Chongyun, for example, you have this longer diamond shape for the pupil. For Wanderer or Raiden, there would be a light inside the iris. Finally, we're adding highlights. These can either be 2 highlights, just one small dot or shape, a very small highlight, or we also have no highlights for a few characters. And for the placement of these highlights, they're mostly in the upper half of the iris, at a side below the iris, or sometimes for smaller ones, they're in the middle of the lower iris, and in a few cases, they also go into the white of the eye. Finally, for the white of the eye, a shadow cast by the lashes is often drawn in. Next, let's talk about the face shading. Around the eye, you'd often have a shadow on the eyelid, but for more aggressive looking or angled downwards or deeper set eyebrows, you also often have the shadow under the eyebrow. On the face, a shaded outline of the face contour is added in at times as well. A bit of blush under or around the eyes is also added in for mostly female and younger characters often. Next, let's move on to the hair that's covering the eyes or eyebrows. Usually the eyebrows are still partly visible underneath, while for the eyes they can either be fully or partly visible underneath. Now that we've talked about the face, let's move on to the hair. For the line art, mostly just a outline is used. It's pretty simple, not too many small strands are portrayed through lines. They're mostly portrayed through shading. In some cases you also have the hair liner transitioning into the shading here. Now for the shading of the hair, the shapes used to portray this are often zigzaggy. The changes of brightness usually appear in a spherical way, portraying the volume of the head this way. The beginnings and ends of hair are often darker. The hair shading here also often doesn't just include different changes in brightness but also in hue. In some cases you'll have mostly sharp shapes, and other ones also many painterly ones where you have colors transitioning. The hair parts are separated through the brightness and hue variation. This also defines more hair strands. Smaller lines can be added in through this here as well. Then for the highlights, these tend to be around the forehead. For some characters they can be smaller, for others they are bigger. In a few cases a shadow is also added underneath the highlight. The highlight shapes are also in some cases sharp, while in other ones they are more painterly. To paint this shading I would use the lasso selection tool mostly, add gradients with a airbrush, and finally add some painterly strokes with a hard round edge brush with varying opacity. Here I would then focus on adding more hue variation and separating the layers of hair. Here are the layers I would use for shading the hair. First I would start with the base, then I would add a layer to separate the parts and add over gradients to the hair. Then I would add a layer to add in shadows at the start and ends of the hair. Next I would add a layer for hue variation or outline shadow borders. Then I would add in the highlight layer, and if there's a shadow below the highlight I would first add this and then the highlight layer. And in some cases the hair around the face will also have this slight overlay applied to it with the skin color, which can also be added in as a final layer here. This makes the hair around the face appear softer. Short intermission. I would add that I've opened up a Patreon. Currently I would like to share some of my screen recorded process videos on there, since they tend to be too long for YouTube. I often just use parts, make them very sped up, or include time lapses instead. So if you'd be interested to see my process in more detail, you can check it out. I've put the full process video of drawing the basic character from this video up on there, for example. You can also let me know what else you would like to see me share on there. Alright, now back to the analysis. Now we're moving on to the clothes. If you're interested in finding out about what clothing pieces are included and how the character's outfits are structured, I would recommend checking out my character design analysis video. For the overall clothing style, you can see fantasy, armor, medieval, modern, and different cultures being combined in the outfits. The different materials they're made up of are shaded fitting to them. The leather is shaded differently from fur or from metals, for example. The outfits are overall made up of a base that can include a shirt, pants, a dress, a corset, and so on. Then you often have some layers added through a jacket or cape, for example. And finally, you have accessoires. For many Genshin characters, you have many of them. Patterns are another commonly used element here. All of this makes the outfits detailed and intricate. Often you will also have some shapes that can be repeated in different ways throughout a design. This is all fitting to who the character is, but that would just be a small part of what I talked about in the character design video. Now for the focus of this video, how the clothes are drawn. The lines for them focus on the silhouette of the outfit parts. The lines look pretty clean, meaning clear changes of direction are used most of the time, but this can depend a bit on each character's design and the way the card illustration is drawn. For the clothes, you'll also often have some depth added to them, meaning you have an outline that kind of shows the side of the clothing piece and not just a flat surface. The folds are mostly portrayed through shading. For this, triangular, rectangular, and painterly shadow shapes are used with a rendering fitting to the material of the clothing part. The shading looks pretty much realistic, but just slightly simplified often. You have many varying levels of values, hues, and blended shapes in the clothes shading. And sometimes a colored outline would be added as well. This can also be the case for the shading in general, what I'll talk a bit more about later after the next aspect, the colors. Here I'd say they're not too tinted in any hue. Pretty saturated colors are used, and depending on the character, in the black, grey and white parts of their designs you can usually tell the overall underlying color scheme, if it's cool or warm, yellowish or purple, and so on. Often you'll have a warm black for pyro characters and a cooler black for hydro characters here, for example. Almost all designs and characters will have a primary color for their outfit, like red, blue or purple, along with gold and in some cases silver. But for example, Kaveh, Xiangling, Itto, Albedo and Noel rather have two main colors in their design. Mostly the colors will fit to the character's element, but in a few cases it can also be contrasting to the character's element. And for the hair and eye colors, this can sometimes be really different and sometimes similar to the design. The Genshin card illustrations are lit in a rather neutral way. The character is lit brightly overall with no particular heavy lighting direction or color. Because of this, it makes sense that the colors are pretty realistic or neutral. This would then also influence the next aspect, the shading. So as lighting scenario, here we'd have a brightly lit character. The shadows are often ambient occlusion ones, simply showing the volume of the character's parts by adding a outline or highlight to the edges of the different parts. Other than this, cast shadows are also painted in, depending on the object's distance and angle to the shadows they're casting. Then shadows themselves are mostly painterly, you'll only have a few sharper ones. You can especially see this in the shadow edges, they tend to not be completely sharp often. However, all of this can also slightly vary depending on the character. The darkest skin shadow would most often be placed underneath the neck. In some cases, the neck shading includes more and less saturated shadows. All of this draws some attention to the face, and you can especially see the ambient occlusion outline shading on the legs of the characters, for example here for Zhangling or Yanfei. For the saturation of the shadows, they tend to be around the same or slightly more saturated than the flat colors. Finally, I would add that highlights on the hair, outfit or body parts lead to a lot of shininess of illustrations. You can especially see this in zigzaggy highlights on shiny materials. For layers to shade, I would start with a ambient occlusion shadow, then I would add in the cast shadows. On the next layer I would add folds, and on a final layer I would then add in hue variation and possibly lights, but you could also just add all of the shadows together. This depends on what kind of process you prefer for shading and rendering. Here I'm also adding a small simplified example of how the gold would be shaded. You have 4 levels: the base, the first shadow, a darker shadow, and then a added light, and sometimes a colored outline would be added as well. The final aspect I'll talk about will be the extra effects and what stands out. Here I would mention that depth is added by making arms or legs that are far in the back to have less contrast and brighter. This method is overall also used to separate different parts of the character. In a few cases, some light effects from the character's weapons or powers, for example, or for one character, small white particles are added as well. For Kazoi or Raiden, you for example would have turquoise or purple light added from their swords. And finally, I would mention that sometimes part will be outlined with a white line to help separate them from each other. What stands out to me for Genshin's card illustrations here would be the expressiveness and detail of shading for the hair and clothes. All of them are shaded similarly, but still each character looks really unique and nice in their own way, which I find fascinating. And that would be it for the analysis. You saw me apply the things I mentioned on the basic character, but if you're interested in seeing me apply the steps for an actual card illustration drawn with more expressive poses, you can look forward to my next videos. By doing this, I also hope to learn more about the Genshin art style. When applying any theory like the aspects I mentioned here, I like to check what I understood by doing this. So if you would like to hear more about my insights and things I learned from studying the Genshin art style, I would recommend checking out that video. I will also mention my learnings from drawing this basic head and then drawing the card illustrations and how I developed along the way in that video. So if you would like to hear more about this, you can look forward to it. I hope this video was helpful to you. Let me know your feedback in the comments. Thanks for watching and bye.